Greetings.
Hey there.
Oh yeah, I was just telling Toon and Aino, I was like, this is the founder of Brony Con. She wanted to explain why it was important, why it's the most important one really quick, and I thought that, I wanted to share this with a couple of friends.
And
yeah, absolutely.
Oh, sorry.
By the way, are you recording this?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that this would be a good thing to, maybe toss on your YouTube channel or something as you're recording. You ready? I can go into my spiel.
Oh yeah, certainly. It's recording now.
So I was asked, why is it that BronyCon is still the biggest Brony convention? Which is a good question. And people suggested maybe it's because it came first, maybe it's because of management, maybe it's because of other factors. Well, I've had a number of years to observe the unfolding of the convention scene that I've started, and I've formulated what I think is a pretty accurate theory of why, based upon a number of factors. The first is what's called first mover advantage. Now, first mover advantage is a powerful factor in the development of any new industry or field or anything that involves the creation of brands. Be they commercial brands or even charity brands. BronyCon is first and foremost a brand. It is sort of a product. It provides a service. And because BronyCon was the first, that gives an advantage. But it's just that. It's only an advantage. It's not a guarantee. It's not a warranty. And it can be revoked at any moment. For example, the very first furry convention, Confurence, had a very strong first mover advantage. When I was getting into furry fandom back in the mid-1990s, everyone thought furry convention equals Confurence. And I think at one point there was even a Confurence East on the East Coast. Confurence started, of course, on the West Coast, where conventions are more of a thing. But Confurence is extinct now and has been extinct for a decade or so. And so their first mover advantage did not allow them to keep their position permanently. Now, it's worth noting that, for example, the furry community moves a lot slower than the Brony community. So although BronyCon has only been around for 3 years, 3 years in Brony time is like decades in most other fandoms. And BronyCon is still dominant. Why? Well, because they had more going for them than just first mover advantage. BronyCon didn't just move first. It wasn't just founded first. BronyCon also got out of the door with more convention events than any other group. And that was due to me basically being insane and flying by the seat of my pants and being willing to create 4 events within the first year, which is unheard of. To this day, it's unheard of in this fandom and maybe even in fandoms in general. A lot of people think that the first BronyCon was the big one in New Jersey in the Meadowlands. People call it BronyCon 2012. Well, there were actually 2 in 2012, and there were 2 more in 2011. There were 4 events between the first one in June 2011, which had only 100 people, and the 4th one in June 2012, almost exactly a year later, which had 4,000 people. So not only did it go from 100 people to 4,000 inside of 1 year, but it also had 4 events in that time. So it's more than just the first mover advantage. It's the track record that BronyCon was able to set down very, very early. First mover advantage is one thing, but it would have been a little bit different had BronyCon, say, had the first convention and then Everfree happened a few months later and then Equestria LA a few months after that. But if you look back at the history of Brony conventions, and I recommend that you look at Full Paper's Brony Convention Resources page, which has an excellent list, you'll notice that the first 4 Brony conventions were all BronyCons. It didn't go BronyCon, then Everfree, then EQLA, then Canterlot Gardens, then whatever. It went BronyCon, then BronyCon, then BronyCon, then BronyCon. So that compounded the built-in first mover advantage, and it also cemented BronyCon's reputation for being able to pull off event after event after event. And it did that within the first year of the convention scene being a thing, and within the first year or 2 of the fandom existing at all. That is another major factor. There's also the fact that BronyCon has never had a high-profile failure. There have been some hiccups, to be true. There have been some problems, both minor and major, but there's never been a Lost Pegasus event. There's never been a convention that had to be canceled. There's never been anything that made national scandal news. There's been drama, and there'll always be drama with ponies involved or fandoms in general, or really with people involved. But BronyCon's always pulled off good events. Even when problems occurred, people still, by and large, have fun. So that again compounds the two existing things I talked about, first mover advantage and the track record of being able to hold many events. There's also the fact that BronyCon has to date held more events in aggregate than any other convention out there. Other conventions that are considered mature, like Everfree or EQLA, have held 2 or 3 events. BronyCon's held 6, and that in and of itself is pretty remarkable. They're now on their 7th event, which is remarkable for a convention that stretches back less than 4 years, 3.5 years. If you think about that, 7 events in 3.5 years averages out 2 events per year. So it's a number of things, you know. I've been asked, is it management? No, the management of BronyCon has changed, as I said, radically over the years. There have been at least 2 or 3 complete overhauls of the core staff. There were periods, particularly for a period during 2012 and 2013, shortly after I parted ways with BronyCon, where the turnover rate was absolutely huge. And management has changed, management style has changed, management philosophy has changed. What hasn't changed is BronyCon's ability to pull off a successful con. And we're only now getting to a point in the Brony convention scene where it's possible for a new convention to come onto the scene and become a wunderkind, a child prodigy like BronyCon did itself in its early days. We see that with BabsCon, came out of nowhere and on its first event became the second biggest or third biggest. They might be leapfrogged again by Everfree. We don't know. Event in the fandom. But by and large, the first 3 years of Brony fandom history were BronyCon being the biggest and everyone else playing second fiddle. And it's because of the factors that I mentioned. The repetition, the track record of being able to do it over and over, the consistent good results, the first mover advantage. And one thing that I think might matter also is just the name. It's common in any given field for the biggest or first product or service or brand in general to become what's called a genericized trademark. And people have started lawsuits over this. This is like when you say to someone, give me a Band-Aid. Well, what you really mean is an adhesive bandage or just a bandage or what's called in the UK a plaster. But Band-Aid in the US has become the generic term, but it's really not generic. It's a trademark of one specific brand of bandage. Similar with Xerox, a brand name of a copying machine, or Hoover, meaning vacuum cleaner, Frigidaire, meaning refrigerator, etc. BronyCon has sort of become almost a genericized trademark for a convention for the G4 fandom. And part of that is simply because the name itself is relatively generic. It's a con for bronies. It's BronyCon. But also there was the factor of that first mover advantage and that repetition, hammering the name into people's heads over and over. And it should be noted that another factor in BronyCon's rise was it was well marketed. It was relentlessly marketed. Equestria Daily was probably the biggest factor in the early growth of BronyCon, because I learned early on of the importance of exposure, of getting that brand out in front of everyone's eyeballs. And so there were a ton of stories about BronyCon on EQD, and that became sort of the vehicle on which the PR for the convention was played out. Only after a few years did BronyCon reach a point of saturation where people already knew that BronyCon was a thing. It doesn't really need to advertise. It does advertise, of course, and advertising is important, but in building a brand, advertising is critical. Once you have reached enough mind share, as it's said in the corporate world, once enough people already have the idea in your head that you exist, then advertising becomes somewhat less of a factor. It's still a big factor, but to build mindshare, you need advertising, and that's what EQD was able to provide. So that's basically it as far as what made it the biggest, what's made it keep being the biggest for this point and until this point, as far as I can see it. Any particular questions or points you want clarified or want to pick my brain about it?
Go ahead.
When starting a convention, because I've obviously never started a convention before, I don't know the process.
I wouldn't recommend it.
Yeah, I was about to ask. It was kind of related to that. What is the most difficult part of the process, and did you have a unique challenge to it, setting up this particular one?
Well, this was the first convention that I ever created, so I can answer unique challenge in terms of compared to the rest of my life, but I can't compare my experiences starting BronyCon to any previous convention experience because I didn't have any previous convention experience. Could you clarify a little, and then I'll give you an answer?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I probably should have clarified. It's obviously there is a process laid out for how you can do this, or at least I'd like to think there is. And obviously one part's going to be more difficult than others. The other part of this question was, did something happen that did not go as planned that maybe almost sank startup, or even or just
I
some minor
I can talk about that. That's really two questions, though. Save the one about things that almost sank it. Put that aside, take a note of it, and ask me after I'm done giving my spiel for the first half of the question. But yeah, I'll talk a little bit about events of the founding of BronyCon. I'm not sure if it's correct to say that there's, a procedure, for example. It's not like there are enough conventions that there's, a set of international standards or anything. There are organizations for con runners. There are websites for con runners. There's now even a web comic about con runners. But I've always been sort of a free spirit and what's called an autodidact, a self-teacher. I've usually taught myself based on intuition and flew by the seat of my pants, which is a good thing and a bad thing, both in very powerful ways. So what I did was I essentially self-taught and self-bootstrapped by fabricating, cobbling together a convention model based on existing convention models. In the case of BronyCon, and of course BronyCon became the standard and has strongly influenced almost every other Brony event, I based the basic model on the model I was used to from the furry world. Now, I'd only been to 2 furry conventions, but I had heard about many more. I had followed a number of their websites and seen their marketing and read about what happens at conventions. So I had a pretty good mental model of how a furry convention works. And I took a large number of elements for BronyCon from that. For example, the dance, the music event, which in the case of Brony Con is called Bronypalooza, a name I came up with. And then there was a similar event at Everfree Northwest. What's theirs called? Brony Stock or Pony Stock? I think it's Brony Stock. And since then, it's become sort of a thing. Brony conventions have EDM events. They have, essentially dances, music events. Well, I lifted that straight from the furry convention standard. Obviously it's not a written standard. It's just that's what people in furry conventions do. There's a dance. There's a music event. Charity auctions. And the first few Brony Cons, the auctions supported the con itself. They basically helped me recoup my own costs because I was operating it out of my own bank account. And they helped me get money to put towards expenses for the next con cycle. The plan was always to transition them to charity events, which was done starting in mid-2012 when the money started going towards charity. And again, the entire concept of having an auction to raise funds for the convention and or for charity was lifted straight from the furry model, where they have such auctions and have had such auctions for decades. But one thing that makes Brony conventions unique from furry conventions is the VIP model, the way that guests of honor are handled. I always noticed that in furry conventions, you have guests of honor, but the furry community is more spread out, more diverse, more nebulous, hard to pin down. There isn't a single show that it revolves around like there is in the case of the Brony community. So I realized that the VIP model for furry conventions doesn't apply here. It would apply if it was a general animation convention, which is something like, now there's DrawCon, which is basically a Western animation convention, sort of the Western equivalent of the Anime Con, which focuses, of course, on Eastern animation. But that's not the case here. We're a fandom based around one show, and not only that, but it's one instance of a show. It's just G4. Bronies aren't generally interested in G1, G2, or G3, let alone G3.5. About which the less said the better. And so the VIP model that I chose was inspired largely by Star Trek conventions, which are in kind of a similar boat. Now, the Star Trek VIP convention model is a little bit different, mostly on matters of scale. Obviously, Star Trek fandom has been a thing for much, much longer. It's almost 50 years old now. There are still probably more Trekkies than Bronies, although that's becoming less certain by the year. But their conventions have been around for much, much longer, decades. And I think they're still larger in scale than even BronyCon, although I'd have to look that up. I don't know how many people go to the big Star Trek con in Vegas. There are also more actors involved. Across Star Trek, you've got 5 or 6 series stretching across 4 or 5 decades. and you've got the movies, the new movies. So all told, you've got hundreds and hundreds of cast members. Pony's not like that. You basically have a couple of dozen cast members, and that's it. And they all have to be shared across a single convention scene, which has dozens of conventions. So people can be spread thin. Now, it's noteworthy that the Star Trek convention scene has basically only one or two big events. It's not like the Brony convention scene that has 3 or 4 big ones and maybe a dozen medium-sized ones and maybe a dozen or 2 small ones. There's just basically 1 or 2 big ones, and pretty much everyone goes to them. That is what happened basically because of licensing, because the company that makes the show, Paramount, essentially officialized one of the big conventions a while back, for better or for worse, and it became the big thing. The model's a little bit different for Brony conventions. We have only a couple dozen cast members, and there are dozens of conventions who have to share them. Now, in the early days, that wasn't the case, obviously. BronyCon was the first convention for the first 4 of them, so I was a little freer to implement a model more directly based on the one that's used by Creation Entertainment, the people who run the Star Trek cons. And that brought in concepts like paying for autograph sales, VIP panels, how to handle, in general, the presentation of VIPs to the audience. And that was glommed onto the existing furry convention model, which I'd used as a base for most of the rest of the convention. And I pulled a few bits and bobs from things like New York Comic Con, general nerd cons, for inspiration for things like the Artist Alley or Vendor Hall. So that's how that model sort of coalesced in the early days. Yeah, I could answer specific questions about this if you wanted more information or wanted to take this in another direction.
Yeah, actually, I have a question.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when it comes to contacting, the getting the guests of honor process, how difficult is that?
It's different now than it was in the early days. Nowadays, now that there's an established Brony convention scene, and there's been sort of established a sort of order for how things go, not just in terms of the conventions themselves, but in terms of how the VAs and the agents and Hasbro and DHX, RIP, by the way, and their successor handle things, there's sort of an established set of standards now. There wasn't in the early days. Nowadays, you just have to be able to approach them with a viable plan, have them believe in you, that you're not going to go LPU on them, throw enough money at them, and have a compelling enough reason for them to choose your convention over others. In the early days, things were very different, and I guess that sort of will be called back upon when I answer what were the things that almost sank the con. But yeah, in the early days, things were very different. There was interference, shall we say, from on high, but it started out very, very tentative, almost like an exploratory first date. The first VIP from the show staff, not from the fandom, was at the second BronyCon in September of 2011. Had around 300, 400 people. No hard head count was taken, but it was at least 300, 400. And that was Jason Thiessen and his wife Jocelyn Thiessen, who also worked on the show, might still work on the show, I'm not certain. I think she was a storyboarder or an artist. Jason, of course, was the showrunner for the first however many seasons. And it was very casual. I managed to contact him via email. I said, "Hi, I run BronyCon. It's a convention for bronies in New York. We had our first event in June. We'd like to announce you maybe for the next one. If you'd be willing to come, we'd pay your travel expenses," and yada, yada, yada. And it was very simple, and at that time it was very affordable because there was no established set of fees. So things started relatively low and started to creep up over the years. So Jason and Jocelyn flew out. They took back, their notes and recordings and photos to the mothership, told Hasbro and DHX how it went. Hasbro and DHX were like, okay, sounds pretty good. And in general, things went upwards from there in terms of involvement of the show staff and fees involved and the number of VIPs who have been called to go to these conventions. Everything started ramping up and up and up and up. There were some major catastrophes along the way that almost sank BronyCon and could potentially have sunk the entire convention scene. But by now, things have developed into a stable state, and as long as it looks like your convention's going to make it, you've got a shot, essentially.
Aeon, you had a question about further elaborating.
No. I just remember that Purple Tinker was going to actually answer my question later, so...
Oh, no, I thought this was later, since there was a pause in the action. I was just reminding you in case you forgot.
Oh, well, unless Aino has a question, or Zach doesn't have another question, or you don't.
Oh, no, I was just listening.
No, I don't have
Anybody
a
else?
question, so.
Okay. All right.
I'm
So
trying to figure out
I'll.
how to word it.
What's that?
I'm just trying to think out how to word it.
Oh, okay. Well, do you have any wording yet?
No, that's actually what I was waiting for Peter to continue his question.
Yes,
He
carry on.
said he had another part.
Aeon, carry on.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, mine was the what almost sank the con.
I think he's looking for a juicy horror story of something going wrong, maybe? Was that what you were trying to get to?
No, I'm just sort of curious as to how, like when setting up these cons, I can imagine that, because not everything works like clockwork, Murphy's Law, something bad can happen, it probably will happen.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that something had to have happened, but was there anything that even came close to sinking the con, if anything?
Yeah, there were two things that come to mind, and one of them is already pretty well known, and the other is not as well known. And I try to raise awareness because people should know that this is something that happened and something that can happen in a young convention scene. So first, I'll get out of the way the thing that everybody knows. BronyCon January 2012 was very overcrowded, and some people didn't get in. They were refunded, of course, but it caused a big problem at the time, and there was a change in leadership, whereupon I stepped down and one of my other staffers stepped up. And at the time, that was big drama. So that's one thing, but obviously it was resolved in the end, and even in January 2012, most of the attendees had a great time. It got a rating of 4.21 out of 5, which is, excellent. Anything more than 4 stars out of 5 is great. But at the time, well, thanks. At the time, it was big drama. And at the time, we were afraid that the con would come apart at the seams, but it didn't. The management was rearranged. It was brought under new management, and the show went on. I ran the first 3 events. I planned the 4th. I signed Lauren and John, or rather, I got them to commit to going. There was no actual paperwork until later, but I announced them with their permission, and from there on, there were other people. So I guess out of 7 events, I did 3.5, or 3 1/4, or 3 1/3, something like that. But new management was brought in, and there's been turnover since, and there's been new management and new management. But that, in the end, didn't sink the con, obviously. There was another thing, though, that happened that a lot of people don't know about, and that was something that we essentially couldn't have done anything about. It wasn't an internally imposed problem of something that BronyCon could have done differently, like the crowding issue, or of a management issue, like the power struggle that occurred in early 2012. This was something that was externally imposed by Hasbro themselves. And this happened actually twice. And it was so early in the development, not just of BronyCon, but of Brony conventions in general, that it threw a spanner in the works and threatened to destroy BronyCon and possibly take down the scene with it. That went like this. Sometime in late 2011, I believe it was November or December, I had already announced Andrea Libman, who was the first VA to be announced for any Brony convention, by the way, and only the 3rd show staffer after the 2 Teesons, Jason and Jocelyn. And I had already announced Nicole Oliver, who had heard about it, I think through Andrea, and expressed interest, and her agent approached me, and I signed her, and she was announced. I had then finally managed to get into contact with Ashley Ball, whose agent at the time, I think she no longer works with them, had given me short shrift for whatever reason, but Ashley had been interested in attending. And when she and I finally managed to speak with each other, we quickly worked out a last-minute idea to have her attend as well. So I announced Ashley at what was relatively the last minute. I think it was less than a month before the event. And then a day or two after the Ashley announcement dropped, I get a bombshell in the email from the producer of the show at the time, Sarah Wall. And Sarah basically says, okay, someone leaked something, and so Hasbro is running scared, and basically your VIPs are sort of on indefinite hold, and I'm sorry, I wish it was better news, but bad things are happening, and we're not sure if the VIPs will be able to attend. Now, mind you, she was just the messenger. I've got no beef with Sarah at all. Hasbro has this nasty habit of allowing other people to serve as harbingers of their bad information, as messengers for them. They very seldom, at least in the early days, and from what I've heard from my colleagues, who have been involved in the convention scene as long as I have, they're still doing this today. Well, I guess I should say almost as long as I have. Technically, no one's been involved as long as I have. But apparently Hasbro is still like this. They can be like talking to a brick wall, and they send other people to indirectly and usually vaguely deliver their bad news. So that's what happened. There it was, December of 2011. I had the third BronyCon coming up, the one in January 2012, the infamous Hallway Con, which had Andrea, Ashley, and Nicole already announced, already signed, already with money sent, and suddenly I was told indirectly from Hasbro via their messenger that, well, maybe they can't come and maybe they can, but we don't know, and we don't have a timeline for when we will know. Let that sink in for a second and imagine how terrifying that was. Here I was a few weeks before a convention where hundreds of people were paying collectively dozens or hundreds of thousands of dollars to travel to New York City, stay in New York City, and attend a convention where they were promised that they would see Andrea, Ashley, and Nicole. And here I was with insider knowledge that had not made the public eye yet, that maybe they wouldn't have Andrea, Ashley, or Nicole. It would just be a bunch of bronies in a room. I was terrified, to put it mildly. I was soiling my pants terrified. And I attempted in vain to get a hold of our contact at Hasbro, a gentleman named Matt. I nicknamed him Stonewall because all he would ever do, it seems, is dodge calls, dodge emails, and ask anyone who was involved in the convention scene in 2011, 2012, or 2013. They probably know exactly who I'm talking about. Matt was bad news for the Brony convention scene. He was supposed to be their liaison to the Brony convention world, but he didn't do much liaisoning. And part of it was because he was sort of wedged into that job against his will. Obviously, he didn't start out as a Brony convention liaison. Hasbro just sort of said, well, if you need to deal with these weird Brony people, you do it. And, well, mostly his job consisted of dodging phone calls and giving vague misinformation and postponing contact. So, as you can imagine, that was very frustrating. I spent a week or two panicking, lost in a state of sheer shock and terror, because had I told the public that there was a chance Andrea, Ashley, and Nicole couldn't make it, the con would have immediately fallen apart, and with it, probably the entire con scene. It was still very, very early. There hadn't yet been an Everfree. There hadn't yet been an EQLA. There had only been 2 BronyCons, and they're the ones that in retrospect almost nobody remembers because they had only 100 and 300 or 400 people respectively. It was very early, and already there was the threat that Hasbro was putting the kibosh on the whole thing, and they were going to pull the plug on all of the VIPs, and that would have just shuttered everything. So I knew that if I told the public, it'd be over. I'd be signing my own death warrant. And yet, at the same time, I felt dishonest and terrible for not telling the public, because I'm a very open person and I tend to speak openly about important issues and ethical issues, and I saw this as an ethical issue in that they had already signed for us, papers had been filed, emails had been written, money had been sent, and as far as any legal expert would conclude, there were contracts, there were existing promises that were made, and they had an obligation to attend. So for Hasbro to come in and interfere with this, that's the sort of thing upon which successful lawsuits are built. But if I had told the public about this, in conjunction with my belief that people should know how these events are run, at least to a basic extent, it would have killed everything. So in the end, at the urging of some of my staff members, and, I would have probably eventually come to the same conclusion, but I was in a bad emotional state at the time. I was in no position to behave very rationally about it. But in the end, I was persuaded to keep my trap shut, to essentially take a Faustian bargain, no pun intended, and count on the good graces of Hasbro, which is a dangerous position to be in, let me say, that they wouldn't, in fact, pull them, because if they did pull them, it would look bad on them. So in the end, they, in fact, didn't pull them. But I didn't get notification of this until I think 3 or 4 or 5, something like that, less than a week before the convention, which is remarkable if you think of it. I didn't find out until less than a week before the event that, okay, they got the go-ahead, it's fine. But that was complete seat of your pants flying right there. And in retrospect, there wasn't really anything I could have done differently. Had I told the public, the con would have collapsed like a house of cards, and the ensuing panic would probably have caused Hasbro to pull out anyways. events. So that would have definitely tanked BronyCon. It would have probably tanked, or at least severely impacted other events that were planned, like Everfree, and I think EQLA was in the works by then. I could be wrong. But definitely it would have impacted Everfree. It certainly would have impacted public trust in Brony conventions being a thing that can happen, which was my mission back then, was to establish that Brony conventions were a thing that could happen. Nothing would blow up, the world wouldn't come to an end, and Hasbro wouldn't squish them, and the VIPs would have a good time. And the attendees, of course, would have a great time. That was my goal, to basically establish that Brony conventions were possible, were sustainable, were repeatable. And I did that, but this came very close to destroying the establishment of trust between the con-going public and the convention scene, which at the time was very, very larval, very embryonic. Now, that was bad enough, what they did before BronyCon January 2012. But after that, I kind of assumed, okay, Hasbro has now seen they can have a convention with 3 of their big stars. The stars all came home happy. Andrea left me a wonderful note, as did Ashley. Nicole was very happy as well, contrary to early rumors started in the drama stage of the 2012 BronyCon leadership struggle. But the VIPs were happy, and the attendees were mostly happy, and Hasbro was happy. And so I figured, okay, once we get past this leadership crisis, the worst is over. Well, that wasn't to be the case either. And this further interfered with my own leadership struggle in BronyCon. But that's, that happened. Leadership struggles happen. Changes of leadership happen. But this thing with Hasbro was something that none of us could have really done much about. I figured it was over, but it wasn't. Because the same thing that had happened in December happened again shortly after the new year. I'd have to look back through my emails, but I think it was January or February or something like that, maybe March. It was the first few months of 2012. It happened, I think, within a week after I announced John Delancey. It's funny because the announcements always seemed to precipitate attention from Hasbro, which always had a chance of ending poorly. Well, anyways, obviously Lauren herself was the first, well, actually I can't really say the first bombshell announcement because that was Andrea. And then Nicole and Ashley. But Lauren took it to a whole other level. Lauren was announced at the end of BronyCon January 2012 by Sethisto, I believe, on stage. And the Brony world went nuts, and people started registering for BronyCon. We were getting tons and tons of early registration, tons and tons of VIP seats being sold, which were very important because those front row seats, and by the way, that model was again lifted from Star Trek fandom, where you pay more to get a better guaranteed seat and other perks. I just grafted that wholesale onto the model of how to run the convention. But we started getting tons of VIP sales and a large number of pre-regs, and everything was great. So shortly after that, I was approached by one of John Delancey's handlers who came to me, negotiated the terms for John to appear, and we announced John. Shortly after that, I again get notification, again via a third party. I believe this time it was one of the agents. It wasn't Sarah Wall. And again, it was not Hasbro themselves. Hasbro never seems to issue their own bad news. They always do it indirectly. Around as direct a response as you tend to get from Hasbro is if you get a response from Hasbro's lawyers, and even Hasbro's lawyers aren't really Hasbro per se necessarily. I believe they contract with a third-party law firm for a lot of their stuff. I could be wrong. But anyways, they don't tend to give direct responses. So I heard from an agent, one of the agents for some of the main characters, who said basically what Sarah had told me back in December, well, your VIPs are in jeopardy. Now, it's noteworthy that the situation at this point was a little bit different than what happened with Andrea, Ashley, and Nicole. Andrea, Ashley, and Nicole all worked for the show under the auspices of Studio B/DHX. I think it was Studio B at the time. I can't recall. They changed names. But anyways, they were all full-time show staff. Lauren and John, who at that point were the only staff members I had announced, were at that point not show staff at all. They were ex-show staff. Lauren had, of course, already departed, and John at that point was a one-time walk-on guest character who'd gone into a VA booth, recorded his lines, and gone home. He was not a recurring member of the cast like any of the main six or Nicole, and he was essentially a contractor. So I had announced essentially an ex-staffer and a one-time contractor. Technically, none of these people were under Hasbro's control. Now, intellectual property law obviously is a very complicated topic, as is employment law, but there's a general concept that once someone stops working for you, you have only limited control over them. One form of control that's obviously accepted is you cannot spread company secrets from your former employer. Everybody knows about that. Everybody knows if you used to work for the FBI, you can't tell everyone state secrets. And if you used to work for Microsoft, you can't reveal Microsoft's trade secrets. That's normal, and that's accepted. Another form of control that someone can exert on their former employee is stipulations for them not working for competitors, so-called non-compete clauses. If I worked for Microsoft, it would be completely legal, rational, and typical for there to be a clause in my contract or terms of employment that say for X number of months or years after my employment is terminated, for whatever reason, I cannot work for any competitor or any entity that directly competes with Microsoft in the workplace. That's standard. So it's completely understandable if Hasbro, for example, wanted to have a clause in Lauren's contract prohibiting her from working for Mattel or another toy company with similar interests in similar industries. And it would have also been completely understandable for Hasbro to ensure that Lauren, or for example John, would not be allowed to disclose Hasbro's corporate secrets. Everybody understands this. Everybody, including myself, expects and expected this. However, what Hasbro did that went above and beyond what's considered normal and what I believe would even be considered legal, the problem, of course, being that they're a multi-billion-dollar international conglomerate with the best lawyers money can buy, and I'm some schmuck from New York City with, a couple of bits and bobs of money to rub together if I'm lucky. The thing that they did was not quite above boards, was that they were essentially asserting that because Lauren and John, because they had at one point been Hasbro employers or contractors or licensees, that Hasbro was allowed to tell them what events they could and could not attend. And that, I believe, and I believed at the time as well, stretched the bounds of legality, to say nothing of morality. But morality is a null term in the legal system. It doesn't matter what's right and wrong. It only matters what's legal and illegal. And what they were essentially attempting to do was to limit their freedom of free association. Now, again, everyone understood that Lauren couldn't get up on stage and tell the people at BronyCon trade secrets belonging to Hasbro. Everybody understood that, and nobody expected for that to be a thing that she'd even be asked to do. But for her to be prohibited from simply attending a convention at all after the terms of her contract, rather, after the duration of her contract had already expired, well, regardless of the terms of her contract, regardless of what was actually in that probably multiple pieces of paper, it probably was not legal for them to be able to tell her, you can't attend a convention that deals with anything about our product. I'm not a lawyer, and I could be very wrong, but a lot of people I've talked to have said, yeah, that wasn't quite kosher. I'm obviously, by my trade, a systems administrator and a programmer. I work in the computer field, in the IT field, and this would sort of be the equivalent of saying, well, Tinker or Jessica, after you're done working for our company, you can't talk at all at any IT convention or computer industry convention about anything even tangentially to do with your time here, even if it's stuff that's public knowledge, even if it's stuff that's not trade secrets at all. You just can't talk about it. And in fact, it went even further than that, because they weren't just saying Lauren couldn't attend BronyCon and talk about pony stuff. They were saying Lauren couldn't attend BronyCon at all. Even if we were going to establish that she's only allowed to talk about Foster's, or she's only allowed to talk about Powerpuff, or she's only allowed to talk about her husband Craig's work, or she's only allowed to talk about her favorite rhubarb pie recipe, they weren't allowing her to attend at all. But that wasn't even the worst of it. because not only did they not want her to attend at all, but they didn't even make that clear. They didn't actually specify whether or not our existing contracts with Lauren and John, which at the time were verbal contracts, were codified as written contracts later on by my successor, but they did not even specify whether or not our existing arrangements with Lauren and John were affected. And every attempt that I made to extract a direct answer failed. I asked them point blank in an email, okay, we understand that you're not going to authorize for us to, for example, sign Andrea again or Ashley again or Nicole again or Tabitha or whatever, but what about our existing arrangements with Lauren and John? They're no longer your employees. Are they affected? I asked them that very directly, and I never got a straight answer. I heard, in fact, contradictory information, again, much of it through third parties. At one point, I heard through a third party that Hasbro was prohibiting all show staff present and past. And at another point, I heard, well, they probably aren't going to. And another point, I heard a number of things that conflicted with each other, but there was never a firm statement from this one way or the other from the Hasbro people. And in fact, it became impossible for me to reach the Hasbro people at all. If I was lucky on a given week or a given month, I would get them to respond to an email saying, we'll talk in X weeks or X months. And it kept getting put off. I'll talk to you tomorrow became, I'll talk to you next week, became ping me after XYZ holiday or ping me next month. And it just kept going on and on and on. And there was no answer. So again, there was a situation where I was put in the unenviable position of knowing that all of the VIPs for BronyCon were in jeopardy. There was no time of resolution planned. There was no resolution necessarily planned at all. It was entirely possible that I never could have gotten an answer until after the con or never at all. And if I had brought that fact to the public, again, the convention would have collapsed. The convention scene would have been irreparably damaged, and I would have gotten sued by hundreds of angry bronies wanting to get their money back for non-refundable flight tickets and non-refundable hotel rooms and other non-refundable expenses, not to mention their severe disappointment at me having promised something that I couldn't deliver, not because of any actions of my own or even actions on the part of John or Lauren, who were complete innocents in all of this, but actions of a third party, namely Hasbro, who had no current employment over these people. And that is how Hasbro almost destroyed BronyCon for certain, and possibly almost destroyed the Brony convention scene entirely. Now, over the course of 2012 and 2013, that's when the current model of relations between Brony conventions and show staffers was finally hammered out. Long story short, the agents, the con orgs, and the show staff themselves were all on one side, and always really had been on one side, and Hasbro was on the other side, trying to, drag their foot and not issue any statements and play cover our ass in the most passive-aggressive way possible. And in the end, the coalition of agents and show staffers, and to a lesser extent con orgs, because let's face it, Hasbro doesn't give, a crap about what con orgs think, but to a lesser extent they do care about what their VAs think and what their VAs agents think. And in the end, the coalition of the willing, to borrow Shrub's term, was able to overcome Hasbro's control freak tendencies and get Hasbro to basically say, all right, we throw up our hands, it's on you. If the agents and VAs want to do something, you do whatever you want as long as you don't violate the terms of the contract or get us in trouble. And if you do, it's completely on you. And that's where we stand. It's essentially up to the agencies and the VAs, and to a lesser extent, possibly for some things, approval from on high, but it's a lot more hands-off. But it took absolute terror and horror within the Brony convention scene for that to happen. And in the end, it didn't just affect BronyCon. It almost destroyed Big Apple PonyCon, which today limps on heavily crippled because they were going to have Tara Strong. Tara Strong had to pull out because of what happened with Las Pegasus. Then they almost got Andrea. There was a whole bunch of big, messy events behind the scenes. But PonyCon was originally supposed to have a number more VAs. But that between Hasbro being difficult and the crash and burn of Las Pegasus, things were very, very difficult in the convention organizer scene in 2012, and to a lesser extent into early 2013. Things were really, really rough. And at least one or two conventions that were originally conceived in 2012 just died, stillborn, like Winter Wrap-Up. No, not Winter Wrap-Up. What was that one? Something Moon, Nightmare Moon, Southern... what was it called? The one in Atlanta. Winter Moon. Thank you. Winter Moon Atlanta was stillborn. Hasbro squished them. Not intentionally, obviously. There was no malice on their part. But their inability to obtain VAs killed them. And I believe there was at least one other convention that went the way of the dodo for similar reasons. So it wasn't just BronyCon affected. Even the other big ones like Everfree and EQLA were affected because it was becoming difficult to impossible for a while to announce new VAs. And this was very rough. It was a terrible time, a stressful time. I bore the worst of the stress, but there were plenty of other con orgs who were tearing their hair out and wondering if their convention was going to have to close up shop. It was terrible, and it was an experience I wouldn't wish on anyone else. So yes, that's the terrible, horrible horror story of how Hasbro almost destroyed our entire convention scene twice.
It must have been quite an ordeal.
It was quite an ordeal. I legitimately thought I was going to end up in Bellevue, the famous New York City mental hospital. I was truly in a bad state of affairs between the stress and the fact that I had lapsed off of my medication, my Prozac for anxiety and anger and depression. I was depressed, I was angry, I was anxious, I was miserable. I had the convention's future hanging by a thread, and there wasn't even anything I could do about it. The thing about me is I'm a very determined person. If there's a problem to solve, if I have to get, plane tickets to fly halfway around the world and walk up a mountain to solve it, well, that's just what I'll do. But if there's something that I literally can't affect, I can't affect the motion of the planets, I can't affect the speed at which gravity pulls us to the Earth, and I can't affect Hasbro. And when I'm faced with something that I can't work through, I sort of panic. It's not the need to control things, it's the need to be able to get my work done. And when I'm kept from getting my work done, I feel paralyzed. And I was utterly paralyzed because everything that the convention needed to be a success, which of course meant all of the VIPs, were in limbo, and they were in limbo twice, and they were in limbo for things that I could not control and by and large could not even influence, because trying to influence Hasbro is like talking to a brick wall.
Well, it's a good thing everything ended up in your favor. I was actually planning on going to BronyCon soon.
It is, and I recommend you do so. You'll have a ton of fun. But it wasn't just my favor, obviously. It ended in everyone's favor, but it was a really, really rough time to be a con org or anyone involved in the behind-the-scenes machinations that were creating the convention scene as we know it today. It resolved happily, but it was not easy. It was not quick, and BronyCon and myself as the creator and the first chair of BronyCon bore the most brunt of it. And to my successors, hey, I'm not trying to get you guys in trouble here. I'm sorry if some of this comes back to bite you, but I felt like I had to get this off my chest because what Hasbro did was not kosher. It was the most anti-Brony thing and the most anti-fan thing that I've ever seen in my life. And it almost tanked half of our fandom. I mean, the conventions have become a tremendous aspect of what it is to be a brony, to live a brony life. And they almost destroyed that. They almost took that away from us. They almost took away our opportunity to congregate in large numbers and interact on an in-person basis, on a regular basis, with the show staffers that we love so much. I'm glad that they didn't, but I'm still deeply scarred from the experience that they did.
Does anyone else have any other questions, or Purple, were there any other points that you wanted to cover?
I think I pretty much went over everything I wanted to say on the subject, but I'll certainly entertain questions.
We kind of did. Go ahead. No, go. You're good, Peter.
I was going to say, if Aino had the wording set straight for his...
Oh, at this point, I'm pretty sure my question isn't going to do any justice.
No, that's fine. If you want to ask, Go ahead.
Well, it was something a little bit more lighthearted.
Yeah,
to be
let's end on
entirely honest.
a positive note, because that was pretty morbid, pretty grim out there.
Yeah, no kidding.
Doom
we don't
and
want this to
gloom
be a
and the
downer,
convention
you
scene
know.
coming crashing down. Let's not end on a downer note. Let's end on an upper note. Because let's face it, it's a good time to be in the fandom right now. It's a good time to go to conventions. The convention scene is thriving. There are a number of new arrivals on the field, like BabsCon and Nightmare Nights, that are just amazing. EQLA is back. Everfree is coming into their, third or fourth year. BronyCon is back for the 7th time. It's a great time to go to conventions. So let's end on a good note. So what is it you wanted to ask about?
Well, actually, I was hoping to go ahead and make a couple commentaries. I'd like to personally thank you among the content creators, because I'm a sketch and vector artist. I'm on DA before I ever became a reviewer. But just everything that you've done, all of the hard work that you've put into designing, Brony Con as a convention, and then essentially creating the staple for what Brony conventions are as a whole. With, Brony Palooza, the musical performance at the end, the brilliant idea of the charity at the end of it, going to whatever we Bronies could donate to actually help out. But then for within the community itself, the Artist Alley and the musical performances for the musicians, everything else, the vendors hall, the people who create. I think we all have a lot to be thankful for from you specifically, because a lot of that came out of your designs for conventions.
Well, I stood on the shoulders of giants, as it's been said. I created the model, but I based the model heavily. Some might say plagiarism is the sincerest form of flattery. Well, I plagiarized from some of the best. I plagiarized from Anthrocon, and I plagiarized from the Star Trek cons, and I took bits and pieces from here and bits and pieces from there. But in the end, what I did was throw a bunch of work at the wall until it stuck. And I did that by basing my work on the work of others who had come before me. And I couldn't have done it without them. There couldn't be a BronyCon if there wasn't a furry convention scene. There couldn't have been a BronyCon if there wasn't a sci-fi or a Star Trek convention scene. There couldn't have been a BronyCon if there weren't people who had established the good ideas that I copied and modified and codified to create the new model that's become sort of the standard for Brony conventions. So I appreciate your thanks. I'm not trying to say I don't need your thanks. No, I'm blushing here, and I'm very thankful to receive your compliments. But I have to give my own thanks to those who made it possible for me to do all of that hard work and for me to create the convention scene. I think maybe I'll end on the note of why. Everybody knows what happened. Now everybody knows a little bit more of how it happened, but I think the question of why it happened is important. Why did I do it all? Why did I throw caution to the wind, risk my career, risk my finances, risk my already precipitously dangling shred of sanity to create the Brony convention scene as we know it today? The answer is because having been in the furry community and having been to a lesser extent in other fan communities, but never to as long of a time lapse as I've been in the furry community, I saw what it was like for a convention scene to have, or rather for a convention scene to exist, for a given fandom to have a robust convention scene whereby they can interact in person. And my justification, my rationale in the early days was, furries and sci-fi fans, but especially furries, have always enjoyed this brilliant convention scene where people can interact in person and there's a real sense of community, and it almost becomes like its own little city, its own little furry town for the duration of the convention. And that's always been a wonderful, powerful community building thing. And Bronies at that point did not have that. The Brony fandom was almost exclusively an internet phenomenon. There was no in-person infrastructure. There was no real-life face-to-face interaction. And I felt that a fandom as large and socially oriented, at least in terms of online socialization, as the Brony community deserved a robust convention scene like the one that furry conventions had provided to furries for decades. And that was why I did it, because I felt that Bronies deserved it, that Bronydom should have been more than just an online thing, that there should have been real-life chat rooms to act as counterpart to the online chat rooms and real events in meet space, where you can meet someone face to face to strengthen the community bonds that already existed through the internet. And the fact that that has come to fruition, that not just my own creations, but the creations of others who came after me have become such an integral part of our community and have made thousands, tens of thousands of people happy, not just in America, but all around the world, is something that brings me great pride and joy. And I couldn't be happier to have done something to play my part in bringing that to reality.
We definitely do have you to thank for all of that. In fact, one thing that I personally have experience with, I've only been to one convention. It was not a Brony convention. I've been dying to get the chance to go to one. I actually missed out on Nightmare Nightcon this past October.
Oh, it was great.
I'm hoping to make it next year, but that's all.
You should do it. It's going to be wonderful.
Oh, you got very sick, actually, unfortunately.
Ooh, that's rough.
Oh, what was it? Esophagus, or what was it?
Oh, actually, that was like 2 months before.
Oh.
But the problem that I had that kept me from going to Nightmare Nightcon was I had a bad tire I had to replace it. I didn't have the finances to replace it. And
oh, so your car was sick.
Well, he was sick before
good way
that.
of putting it. But,
he was sick and his car was sick. So.
Yes.
That's a heck of a
Finances are complete insanity.
Ah, yes, finances.
Anyways, outside of that is, I think one of the things that we also have BronyCon and you personally to thank is the concept for meeting up in face-to-face is the whole idea behind Brony meetups. And there's even one down about a 2-hour drive away from me in a larger city to where, 15 or 20 people get together every week and just talk about ponies, play the card game now that it's out. A few people will do like video recordings and reactions to games with pony mods on them or whatever. It's just, little get-togethers of getting face-to-face with other bronies. And the whole idea of, like you said, why you created BronyCon seems to be the same idea behind these meetups.
Yeah, actually they're more connected than even you think. BronyCon grew out of Brony's NYC, which I also started, but it was only a month after the first Brony's NYC meetup that I created BronyCon and held the first event. So yeah, they're deeply intertwined. They came from the same sources, and just like I was involved in the creation of the Brony convention scene, I was also involved in the creation of the meetup scene. So, and for the same reason, people deserve the ability to meet with people face to face.
Okay, I do have one tiny little question. You can answer it however you want.
Sure.
Is so you've gotten to see it from both sides. So what is your advice for convention goers coming from somebody who has actually run a convention?
Sorry, repeat the question.
I think he was asking, is there any advice that you'd have to convention goers themselves instead of the people running the convention?
Oh, yeah,
right,
absolutely.
from your side of, being part of the whole organization that runs the conventions in the background.
Absolutely. Advice to convention goers. One thing is bring cash. Hotels are always low on cash, and there's often a cash crunch when you get hundreds or thousands of people in a vendor hall trying to extract money from the same overtaxed hotel ATMs. That's just a practical thing. Bring cash, bring a bottle of water, wear comfortable shoes. That's basic stuff. But there's also a couple things, how to get the most enjoyment out of the convention and how to be the most conscientious attendee you can. One thing is to remember that all the people involved in the convention scene, be they convention organizers, convention staffers like security staffers or registration people, other attendees, vendors, VIP handlers, community guests, voice actors, all of these people are people. And sometimes it becomes easy to forget that the people who create these conventions are not gods. They're just people. They're not angels. They're not demons. They're human beings. And they are human beings who put in a ton of work to make sure that these events go on. It's a labor of love. You don't make money doing it. If you're lucky, you break even. More often than not, con orgs lose money. And if you make money, it's going to be under minimum wage. It's completely a labor of love. So that's important to remember, to treat the people behind the convention with the respect that they deserve for the hard work they put in, to understand that the VIPs are only human and that sometimes they don't have the time to sign all of the autographs or to answer all of the questions. And it's not because they're mean, cruel, and ugly. It's because they're only human and there's only so many hours in the day. And when you get 6,000 people trying to get your autograph, you might not have enough time to sign 6,000 autographs. And another thing, support support your vendors, support your artists. A lot of conventions do this one thing where they have a separate artist alley and vendor room. I'm usually in the vendor room because I do more vending of other people's art and posters and toys than art. And I feel that sometimes the artist alley, when it's a separate thing, becomes neglected. And that's a damn shame. These artists do so much for our community, are one of the bedrocks upon which our entire fandom is based. And if you go to a convention, look at the map, see where the artist's alley and or vendor room and or vendor rooms are, and make sure that you give everybody some time, even if you're just browsing. I was once at a convention where there were 2 vendor halls, and I was in the smaller of the 2. And towards the end of the con, or rather towards the end of the first day, we were calling it the Dud Pit or something like that. It ended up becoming a ghost town. Usually there were more vendors in there than attendees. People were losing money. People felt neglected. It was just a miserable place. And fortunately, the convention went above and beyond, resolved the issue, and was able to fix the situation, but it was really bad. And that experience gave me a little bit of insight into what I think it's like in some of these ghettofied artist alleys. Now, mind you, I'm not blaming con orgs for doing that. It's a viable model that they've lifted from other convention types like furry cons, where traditionally there's a vendor hall and there's an artist's alley and they're separate things. The problem is when there's both the vendor hall and the artist alley, people tend to just go to the vendor hall. Don't do that. I'm a vendor. I want your money. That's great. But you got to also give your respect, your time, and yes, your money to the artists who make all of this amazing stuff possible. So look at the map, see if there's a separate artist alley. And if it's halfway across the hotel, guess what? March your bottom over halfway across the hotel and give the artists some love, because they deserve it. None of these people make a ton of money, and they've got fans that they want to see. And even if you're not a fan of theirs, at least give them the courtesy and the dignity of browsing their wares like you'd browse mine in the vendor hall, or someone like Silver Slinger, who everyone has heard of, or someone like John Joseko. Go give the artists some love, give the lesser-known artists some love, and show them how much you care about the work that they've done as well. Another thing is the subject of VIPs. I've said for a while now that people go to the conventions for VIPs, but what they stay for is the sense of community. And I always saw VIPs as a way of getting butts in seats, getting warm bodies into chairs, a way of recruiting attendees. You announce the VIPs, and that brings up your registration count and sells a bunch of tickets. But in the end, what people tend to remember the most from conventions isn't the VIP stuff. That's not to say the VIP stuff isn't important and wonderful and beautiful and sometimes even life-changing. Some of everyone's best memories from conventions have to do with the VIPs, whether it was the time that Tara Strong cosplayed as Twilight Sparkle at Canterlot Gardens, or the time Peter News showed up dressed as an Alicorn princess at BabsCon, or the various VIP meet and greets where hugs are exchanged and tears are wept and VIPs make cute voices into recorders and all sorts of awesome stuff happens. But it's not just about the VIPs. Oftentimes after a convention, the things that stick in my craw the most are hanging out in a wonderful local restaurant with a bunch of bronies that I've never met before, or with a group of people I have met before, with some locals I've never met before and might not see again for a year. And community gatherings like that are a huge part, if not outright the majority, of what makes these events special. Hanging out in the game room at 2 a.m. playing Who's the Changeling, going to the video games room and seeing what's on offer there, talking with other vendors in the vendor hall, going to local events, going to local restaurants, walking around a local park, helping each other out with problems locating housing or getting displays put together for the next day. All of that community stuff is really important. So although VIPs bring people in, the community is far bigger than just who's the headliner. So know that whatever you are attracted to the convention for, you're going to come away with so many good experiences. And let's face it, maybe a few bad ones, but mostly good ones. And they're not always going to be what you're going to expect. You're going to have a great time, and a lot of that great time is going to be stuff you didn't even anticipate would be a major part of your experience, but will nonetheless become a major part of what made that event special for you. to. And I hope that all of you who are considering attending conventions do so. It's a wonderful experience as an attendee, as a vendor, as a con org. There's a lot of good times to be had, and it's a lot of work for a lot of us who are involved in the other side, who aren't the attendees, but who are putting it on or vending at it or coordinating at it or whatever. But it's worth it. It's a lot of fun. Do it. Give the cons some love. I'm going to be at tons of conventions. I hope to see everyone, and I wouldn't trade it for the world.
That sounds like a wonderful note to end on.
Sounds like it too. I think I need a cough drop. I've talked a lot. But I hope that my lip flapping and gum smacking has made some sense, and that maybe this has shed a little light into the early days. And talk to me then.
All right, take care.